Hello, welcome back to Fallout 76. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been going across a bunch of media covering Concord, a game that shut down recently. And one of the things that came to mind was that Fallout 76, by all rights, should have ended up the same way. But obviously that's not the case, so that got me started thinking about why the outcomes were different. Most of the talk about Concord focused on the LGBT aspects it incorporated, but I've also come across people actually discussing the gameplay and why it failed. They raised some good points, and frankly, I think there's an interesting contrast in comparison to be drawn with how Fallout 76 managed to survive its own disastrous launch. For those of you who aren't across Concord, the gist of it is that it's a PvP hero shooter, and somewhere between $100 to $200 million was spent on making the game. But on launch, it just never got any kind of traction. We're talking an all-time peak of 660 people on Steam. There's no information on how many were playing on PlayStation, but it can't have been that many. Basically, it was a total loss. The game shut down recently and refunded the people who purchased it. You'd be right to argue that Fallout 76 launched in a far worse condition than Concord, especially if you include all the fan service materials, like the helmet that had to be recalled due to mold, the definitely not canvas bag, and the plastic bottles of Nuka Dark that were just a shell on a glass bottle. Then on top of that, people who tried to get refunds were doxxed. I've made plenty of arguments about the positive aspects of Fallout 76, but frankly, I couldn't blame the people who bought those goodies if they never played any Bethesda game ever again. It was just that bad. By all rights, Fallout 76 should have died at birth, just like Concord did. But of course it was a Fallout game, and it was able to draw on the massive fan base that the series has. Most of the early players were turned off by the game, but there was a proportion that stayed with it, and that gave it a chance to evolve into something better. That's one of the factors that Concord didn't have. There was no emotional investment in the name Concord. It doesn't mean anything to anybody. In situations like that, first impressions are critical, and this is where the characters come into it. Ultimately, if you have no prior knowledge of a game, or a movie, or any kind of media, you have to rely on those snippets of information that you do get. So with movies, the trailers are key to driving up interest and setting expectations of what you'll be watching. Same with interviews with the lead actors. It's all about drumming up the hype. For a game, the look of the characters plays the same part, because they're going to be front and center in any trailer or any gameplay footage you make. I personally don't get into my character's look too much, but there's a reason why Geralt, Adam Jensen and Kratos look the way they do. Whether we like it or not, looks do matter. There's a reason why attractive people usually get to play life on easy mode. Not always, but it is a definite advantage. In a first-person game, you're not going to be seeing your character too much, but you'll definitely be seeing other characters. And unfortunately, the characters in Concord just don't have an eye-catching design. This has nothing to do with LGBT per se. It's entirely possible to create a gay character that has an appealing look and feel. Of course, there would be some that objected to that aspect, regardless of anything else. For example, there's stories of Fallout 76 players who've had their camps destroyed because they had LGBT-friendly messages. I could be mistaken because you can never see all the servers, so maybe it's worse in different regions. But in my experience, situations like that are few and far between. Fallout 76 even has a rainbow flag as one of the icons. And because new icons you unlock get set by default, that means that for a time, many people were just running around with that flag as their icon. Including me. I never even noticed until someone pointed it out on a stream. But that didn't lead to a storm of criticism, did it? In Concord's case, it seems that a lot of the available characters had their sexual preferences listed as part of the character, and I'm sure that might have put off some people from trying the game. But to me it seems that the look and feel was the issue, not whether they were gay.
Why are you gay? You are gay.
Or whether they just have sex with anything and everything in the galaxy. Yeah, that means you, Shepard. Now there's a character that lives by the old adage that any hole's a goal. Exploring the galaxy one black hole at a time, eh? Most games nowadays have a gay romance option, and it's entirely possible to have a character be the gayest gay that's ever gayed without a massive protest. Concord didn't make their characters appealing enough, and that failed to garner the attention that it needed at launch. In contrast, Fallout 76 is very much Fallout in its look and feel. There is a definite argument to be made about whether it's Fallout in the gameplay sense, but in terms of how it looks and how it feels, it's clearly a Bethesda Fallout game. And that plays a large part in why it's still drawing in Fallout fans, like it did after the Fallout TV series. But if the gameplay is good enough, that can be enough to overcome a disastrous launch. Example number 1 is Fallout 76. I literally can't think of a worse launch for a major game studio on the level of Bethesda, although Concord has to be a contender now. We've talked about how Fallout 76 was able to draw on the existing fanbase, but a lot of credit has to go towards the developers and how they've adapted the game over time. At the beginning, Fallout 76 was meant to be a survival experience with plenty of PvP. You were meant to struggle for resources against other players. But it turned out that the existing Fallout fanbase were not into that, which is completely understandable. Fallout games have always been single-player, story-driven games, so even the idea of PvP wasn't going to appeal to most of them. But another aspect is that there's also a lot of games that do something similar in the survival PvP space, like Rust for example. My entire experience was of starting the game, harvesting a few trees, then going to sleep next to a nice little lagoon. The next time I logged in, apparently someone had killed me while I was offline. And that's the entirety of my Rust experience. I never played that game again, because if you can get killed offline, then that's just not a game I can ever play. And there's plenty of other survival PvP games. People aren't starving for choice by any means. But what exactly made Fallout 76 better than those other games? Arguably, Fallout 76's PvP is worse than its competitors because of VATS. When you can guarantee headshots on other players, it becomes more about weapons, armor, and how quickly you can suck down consumables to restore health and action points, rather than about player skill. And no camp can ever withstand an attack from a decent player, so it's not like you can actually fortify yourself in there and rely on turrets for protection. So in its early stages, it's pretty clear that the game wasn't appealing enough to the existing Fallout fanbase, but it also wasn't appealing to potential new players who prefer PvP. In a word, it was uncompetitive. Concord faced a similar issue. It was trying to be a PvP hero shooter in a field that has Team Fortress, Overwatch, Valorant, Apex, Fortnite, and so on. All of which are free to play, by the way. Yet Concord was being sold for $40. That begs the question, did it offer enough quality to compete with established games? And was it good enough to merit paying for it? From the results, it seems fairly clear that the players who tried it didn't think so. The tiny player peak indicates that it didn't make a sufficiently good first impression to draw in players, as we talked about before. But from the way the player counts dropped off, it seems fairly clear that the game itself wasn't at the level of its competition. Obviously I can't test it myself anymore because it's been shut down, but people who played it when it was available have said that they found the balance lacking. A couple of characters were clearly more powerful than others, and that a lot of the customization options you find in existing hero shooters were lacking. One phrase that stuck with me was that it was a game trying to compete with hero shooters from 8 years ago, when Concord first started development. So while Concord was still trying to catch up with the past, the other hero shooters moved the goalposts even further ahead, which unfortunately tends to be the case with many games that have drawn out development cycles. Duke Nukem Forever is a well-known historical case. By the time it released, it was outdated. And because most people tend to play PvP games together with their friends, that means that it was doubly difficult for Concord to attract new players. You not only have to draw interest, you also have to get enough interest for entire communities to come over, and to convince those communities to give up everything they've invested in their old games, including purchases. And that's just to draw enough players to survive. To succeed, Concord would have had to be clearly the best game in its class, which clearly doesn't seem to have been the case. The bar was extremely high, and clearly that bad first impression didn't help matters. And of course we know how things ended up with Concord. But on the other hand, Fallout 76 is still here, so that begs the question of how it became competitive enough to survive. Anybody who's played the game recently knows that survival PvP is most definitely not the way you describe this game now. You can go as hungry or thirsty as you want and it doesn't matter. You can have all the diseases and they'll go away on their own. Resources are plentiful enough that it's become a custom to gift lower level players with goodies like stimpaks. And for PvP, you just enable the pacifist mode and you can ignore anyone shooting you. The developers pivoted hard towards a PvE style where it's the players versus the world instead of players versus players, and made the game difficulty casual. A level 1 character can participate in everything. They often don't because they assume they can't, but they can. Effectively, Fallout 76 changed categories. It's now closer to games like Stardew Valley than it is to games like Rust. Once you know what you're doing, it's a relaxing game. But at the same time, it's also different from games in its new category. Most of these relaxing games aren't generally about combat. Yes, you can delve in caves in Stardew Valley, engage enemies in combat, and you can get plenty of rewards for doing that. But it's not a core part of the gameplay. You can spend your time sitting around just doing farming, fishing, and talking to people, and you'll enjoy the game just as much. But combat is a core part of Fallout 76's gameplay. Almost every activity in the game involves combat. How many games can you think of that are focused on combat, yet are also relaxing? I think that Fallout 76 almost created a new niche of its own, where there's basically no competition. And that uniqueness is what's allowed it to stay viable. So Fallout 76 had a disastrous launch. But it also had the luxury of an existing fanbase to draw on, and that gave it time to change. Which, to Bethesda's credit, they did. They radically changed the game in a way I've seen few developers do. New players are constantly surprised by how nice the game is when they try it. Part of that is how the reality of the game differs from the bad reputation the game still has. But part of it is that the game clearly does some things right. And as a result of these changes, it's in a niche of its own. So much so that people who like that niche stick around, because there really aren't that many alternatives. Concord, on the other hand, was trying to break into an extremely competitive field, and it just doesn't seem to have had the quality to draw players away from established games. Yes, the bad first impression sure as hell didn't help, but that's by no means the only reason. The bar for what they were trying to do was just too high. And because it was a new IP with no existing emotional ties to draw players in, it simply never got the time to change and improve. It could have been very easy for Fallout 76 to also end up in the scrap heap of history, but fortunately it hasn't.